The Old West is often remembered as a land of freedom, open plains, brave cowboys, simple rules. But that version was carefully cleaned, polished, sold. The truth is darker. Many facts about the Old West were quietly removed from school books, town records, and public museums. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too disturbing. What really happened on the frontier was not heroic. It was brutal, lawless, and often intentionally hidden. Tonight, we begin with two facts so bizarre that even historians once refused to write them down. Fact number 1. Some towns legally banned kindness in several Old West mining towns. Helping a stranger could get you arrested. This wasn't a rumor. It was written law. Towns that grew around gold and silver mines were flooded with desperate men-injured workers, starving migrants, sick travelers. Local leaders feared that sympathy would slow productivity. If people helped the weak, fewer men would work the mines, so laws were created. In towns like early Bodie, California, ordinances allowed sheriffs to arrest anyone who fed, housed, or medically treated an unemployed stranger without permission. Charity was seen as rebellion. Compassion was treated as a threat to order. A dying man on the street was not a tragedy. It was a warning. Most residents learned to walk past suffering without looking down. Children were taught this early. Mercy was dangerous. Kindness made you suspicious. These laws were later erased from town charters when the West tried to clean its image. But court ledgers still exist, listing fines for unapproved aid. And this leads to a darker question. If kindness was illegal, what was encouraged? Fact number 2. Justice was often a paid service in many Old West towns. Justice wasn't blind. It was rented. Judges were often unpaid or underpaid. Sheriffs relied on private funding. This created a system where wealthy citizens could quietly pay for outcomes. If you were rich, charges could vanish. If you were poor, even self-defense could end in execution. Some towns openly allowed case sponsors, men who funded court operations in exchange for influence. Trials could last minutes. Evidence was optional. Witnesses were threatened or bribed. Executions happened fast, not because guilt was clear, but because the town wanted the problem gone. Records show people hanged for crimes that didn't exist in law books. Others were sent away without explanation, never recorded as dead or alive. The Old West didn't always punish crime. It punished inconvenience. And the worst part? Many of these practices were technically legal at the time. As the frontier expanded, these systems grew quieter, more efficient and more cruel. By the time the West was civilized, thousands had vanished without a trace. We've only just begun. The Old West loved the idea of toughness. Pain was respected, silence was admired, and weaknesses, patiently spoken weakness, was punished. That belief shaped laws that sound unreal today. Fact number 3. Some towns banned women from reporting crimes in several frontier towns. Women were discouraged or outright banned from filing criminal complaints, not unofficially, a policy. Town councils believed women were emotionally unreliable. Their testimonies were seen as disruptive, especially in cases involving violence, assault, or abuse. Reporting such crimes was considered bad for business. It scared workers, it scared investors, and it threatened the image of control. So instead of protecting victims, towns protected silence. If a woman tried to report a crime, she was often redirected to a male guardian husband, brother, or employer. If she had none, her complaint could be dismissed entirely. In some mining towns, repeated attempts to report violence could result in fines for public disturbance. The message was clear: endure quietly, or be punished for speaking. This system didn't reduce crime, it buried it. Many women disappeared after trying to report abuse. Records list them as moved on or left town, even when witnesses knew they hadn't. Their stories survived only in private letters, hidden, burned, or sealed away. And this silence created something worse. Fact number 4. Vigilante groups were quietly protected by law. When official justice failed or refused to act, vigilante groups filled the gap. But here's the banned truth. Many of these groups were not illegal. They were protected. In several territories, laws existed that allowed citizen enforcement committees to operate during periods of public threat. The definition of threat was vague. It could mean crime. It could mean protest. It could mean someone speaking too loudly about injustice. These groups decided guilt on the spot. No trial, no defense. People were whipped, branded, exiled, or killed based on group consensus. And because these acts were done in defense of order, sheriffs often refused to interfere. Sometimes, the same men wearing badges at night wore masks by day. Official records rarely mention vigilante violence. Instead, they use phrases like left jurisdiction or incident resolved. Families searching for missing relatives were told not to ask questions. The West celebrated these groups as heroes. But behind closed doors, towns feared them. Because once violence becomes normal, anyone can be next. By the late 1800s, pressure grew to erase this history. Laws were rewritten, documents were destroyed, museums focused on outlaws instead of systems. But the silence didn't mean the violence stopped, it just went underground. The Old West was not just violent, it was economically violent. Death didn't always happen by accident or justice. Sometimes it happened because someone needed it too. Fact number 5. Some towns earned money from executions in several frontier towns. Executions were not just punishment, they were revenue. Public hangings drew crowds from miles away. People paid for food, drinks, lodging, and sometimes even viewing spots. Towns learned quickly that fear could be monetized. Vendors paid fees to sell at execution sites. Saloon owners donated to keep hangings public. Newspapers exaggerated crimes to increase attendance. In some places, the condemned person's belongings were auctioned immediately after death. Boots, coats, tools, even personal letters. The town took a cut. This created a disturbing incentive. More executions meant more profit. Trials became faster, evidence thinner. Accusations, enough, especially against drifters, immigrants, or the poor people no one would defend. Some sheriffs were paid per execution. Officially, it was for security costs. In reality, it rewarded speed. By the time the West began to modernize, records of execution income vanished. But old account books still list event expenses on hanging days. Celebrations of death, balanced in ink. Fact number 6. Bodies were sold for science without permission after execution. The dead didn't always rest. In some territories, bodies were quietly sold to medical schools and traveling scientists. Consent was never asked. Families were rarely notified. Doctors in the East needed cadavers for research. The West provided them cheaply. Executed prisoners, unidentified dead, and even murdered drifters became resources. Bodies were preserved, shipped, and dissected. Some skulls were kept for phrenology and early pseudoscience, claiming skull shape revealed criminal behavior. This meant death didn't end exploitation, it completed it. Families who asked for bodies were told the remains were unrecoverable. Graves, when they existed, were often empty. These practices were later condemned and hidden. Medical institutions erased records. Towns denied involvement. But it explained something unsettling. Why so many Old West graves have names but no bodies beneath them, and if death itself could be sold. What else was turned into property? Old West praised independence. But for children, there was no freedom at all. Childhood was not protected. It was exploited. Fact number 7. Children were legally bound to employers in many frontier territories. Poor or orphan children could be legally bound to employers until adulthood. This was not adoption. It was indentured labor. Local courts approved these bindings quickly, sometimes in minutes. Parents were rarely present. Orphans had no voice at all. Once bound, a child could be forced to work mines, farms, kitchens, or saloons for years without pay. Food and shelter were considered wages. Abuse was ignored unless it disrupted productivity. If a child ran away, they could be arrested and returned, sometimes beaten publicly as a warning. Records describe these children as assets, not people. This system was defended as charity. Towns claimed they were saving children from poverty. In reality, they were supplying cheap, controllable labor. And it didn't stop there. Fact number 8. Schools quietly trained children for dangerous work. Some frontier schools weren't about education. They were about conditioning. In mining regions, boys were taught just enough math to measure, or girls were trained for domestic service. Safety was never taught. In some towns, school schedules matched work shifts. Attendance was optional. Labor was not. Children injured on the job were blamed for carelessness. If they died, records listed accidental causes. Employers faced no punishment. The idea of protecting children came much later. When it did, these systems were quietly dismantled, not exposed. Textbooks skipped this chapter, because admitting it would mean admitting that the Old West didn't just fail children, it used them. And if children could be owned in practice, what happened to adults who had no protection at all? In the Old West, survival was praised. But only if you survived the right way. If you didn't, the law was waiting. Fact number 9. Poverty was treated as criminal behavior. Many frontier towns passed vagrancy laws so broad that simply being poor was enough to get you arrested. No job, no fixed address, no proof you belonged. That was a crime. Sheriffs were allowed to detain anyone who appeared idle or without visible means of support. No theft, no violence, just existence without money. Once arrested, fines were imposed. If you couldn't pay, which most couldn't, you were sentenced to labor. This created a loop that was almost impossible to escape. Work off your fine, get injured or exhausted, miss work, get arrested again. Poverty became permanent by design. Fact number 10. Prison labor replaced slavery in some regions after slavery was abolished. The Old West didn't stop exploiting forced labor. It rebranded it. Prisoners, many arrested under vagrancy laws, were leased to private businesses. Mines, railroads, farms. Companies paid the town. The town provided bodies. Conditions were worse than slavery. Prisoners had no long-term value, so there was no incentive to keep them alive. Injured prisoners were discarded. Dead ones were replaced. This system was legal, profitable, and quietly defended as justice. Official histories call this law enforcement, but it functioned as human extraction. As the West modernized, these programs were hidden behind paperwork. Words like lease, contract, and rehabilitation replaced reality. But the damage was already done. Thousands vanished into labor camps, never recorded as dead or free. If the law could turn poverty into prison, what happened when someone tried to resist? The Old West loved the myth of the armed citizen, the lone figure standing up to injustice. But the reality was the opposite. In many towns, self-defense was treated as a threat to order, not a right. Fact number 11. Victims were often punished for defending themselves. If you fought back, especially against someone powerful, you became the problem. Workers who defended themselves against abusive employers were charged with assault. Women who resisted attackers were accused of disturbing the peace. Even killing in clear self-defense could lead to execution if the wrong person died. Why? Because violence was tolerated only when it served authority. If a saloon owner, mine, boss, or deputy was injured, the law reacted fast. If a drifter or laborer was harmed, the law often stayed silent. Court records show cases where victims received harsher punishment than attackers. Judges called resistance insubordination. Juries, often made up of local business allies, agreed. The message was simple: endure quietly or be destroyed publicly. Fact number 12. Weapons laws were used selectively despite the image of universal gun rights. Many Old West towns had strict weapons laws, but they weren't enforced equally. Poor men, immigrants, and minorities were arrested for carrying weapons. Wealthy citizens and lawmen were ignored. The law was flexible depending on who you were. In some towns, being armed without permission was enough to justify immediate force by deputies. Shoot first, explain later. Meant that those most at risk of violence were legally disarmed. Self-defense became illegal only for the vulnerable. And over time, people learned not to resist at all. Because survival in the Old West wasn't about courage. It was about knowing when to stay silent. And when silence itself became dangerous. The Old West didn't always destroy people with bullets. Sometimes it destroyed them with ink. Paper was powerful, and it decided who existed. Fact number 13. Entire communities were deleted from records when a town-failed door became inconvenient, could be erased. Land disputes, mineral exhaustion, or political pressure often led officials to dissolve settlements overnight. Records were destroyed, maps redrawn, census data lost. Families who lived there were suddenly undocumented. Without papers, people couldn't claim land work legally, or travel safely. Many were arrested as vagrants in neighboring towns. Others vanished into labor systems. The town never existed, at least officially. This wasn't an accident. It was cleanup. Fact number 14. Death certificates were quietly altered in the Old West. Death records were flexible. Causes of death were often rewritten to protect towns or businesses. Murder became accident, abuse became illness, executions became natural causes. Families requesting truth were told records were incomplete or destroyed. This allowed violence to continue without consequence. If no one officially died, no one was guilty. And this system worked frighteningly well. So well that entire generations disappeared without legal proof they were ever alive. And if people could be erased after death, what happened to those who disappeared while living? The Old West was isolated. Law was inconsistent. Oversight barely existed. It made it the perfect place for things that would never be allowed elsewhere. Fact number 15. Prisoners were used in medical experiments in some frontier prisons. Inmates were subjected to unregulated medical testing, new drugs, surgical techniques, disease exposure. Doctors needed human subjects. Prisoners had no rights. Consent was never required. Those who survived were released without records. Those who didn't were buried anonymously or sold to medical institutions. Official reports called this treatment. It was experimentation. And because prisons were often privately funded, there was no accountability. Fact number 16. Mental illness was treated as contagious. People showing signs of mental illness were feared. Some towns believed insanity could spread through contact. So the solution was isolation. People were locked away in makeshift asylums. Others were forced out of town at gunpoint. Families were warned not to ask questions. In some cases, the mentally ill were experimented, unused, to test restraint methods or drug effects. Records of these facilities rarely survived, but their victims did, in silence. Because speaking meant being locked away again. And when fear controls medicine, what else was done in the name of safety? By now, the picture is clear. The Old West you learned about in books, the one with heroes, duels at high noon, and justice for all was carefully constructed. Much of the truth was banned, erased, or rewritten. Fact number 17. Outlaws were marketed as heroes. Many notorious outlaws were actually tools of the town elite. They were allowed to steal, rob, or kill, but only in ways that served the economy or distracted the public. Newspapers romanticized their actions, turning criminals into legends. Meanwhile, towns silenced the victims. This created a false morality, admiration for lawlessness, if it entertained or benefited the powerful. Fact number 18. Entire laws were hidden from public knowledge. Many towns passed ordinances and decrees that were never published. Citizens could unknowingly break the law. Fines, imprisonment, and forced labor followed. The Old West celebrated freedom, but only for those who were in the know. Fact number 19. Children's stories were censored history books. Letters and diaries that described the abuse of children from labor, violence, or forced indenture were burned or withheld. Educators taught sanitized versions. The suffering, ingenuity, and tragedy of the youngest victims were erased, so the West could appear as a land of opportunity. Fact number 20. The frontier's legacy was hidden. The last banned fact is the most subtle. Much of the cruelty, exploitation, and injustice of the Old West was woven into modern myths: cowboys, pioneers, and gold rush adventurers. The stories celebrated courage, grit, and adventure while masking systemic violence. Millions believed the legend, not the truth. But the records remain if you know where to look. The outlaw towns, vagrancy laws, hidden executions, forced labor, and silenced children, they were all real. The Old West wasn't just wild. It was engineered to hide its own darkness. And today, when you hear the stories of heroes and freedom, remember, history often tells the tale the powerful wanted you to hear. The real story, band, disturbing and bizarre, was far stranger than any legend.